did a video a while back in which I compared and ranked all of the tanks in Legion Alpha in an attempt to decide what I want to main upon a release of the expansion. This is the updated video for the new Legion beta builds, which shouldn't see too many more changes before going live at the end of August. In this video, I make reference to summaries I made in my previous video, which should be comprehensible in this abridged format, but if you haven't already seen my alpha ranking video, there's a link in the description below. So, now that Blizzard has had some time to tweak the tanks into versions that they're planning to unleash onto the general public, what's changed since alpha? In short, a lot. So, based on these criteria, here's the executive summary of how I'm rather subjectively ranking tanks toward the end of Legion Alpha. And here's the new ranking. It's a pretty substantial change and goes to show how many alterations developers make before a game is officially released. In the span of a few weeks, tanks I never considered playing are now at the top of my list of potentials, while others that were incredibly strong haven't fared as well as I'd hoped. Anyway, as before, this ranking is purely subjective and the opinion of one single WoW player, so as we delve deeper into why I've ranked them as such, I encourage you to share your opinions and your own tank rankings in the comments below. I definitely read all of the comments and really appreciate hearing from other perspectives. I'm also really keen to hear what you're planning to main in Legion, be it a tank, a healer, or DPS. So if you're interested, leave a comment with a bit of info about your wowing background and what your plans are for Legion. I look forward to reading them. Right, so let's take a look at each of the tanks separately. One thing I will say off the bat is that all of the tanks are viable for both dungeon and raid content, presuming you aren't in a competitive raiding guild, in which case you wouldn't be watching this video. So as long as you have some skills as a tank and can make things work, tank choices will largely come down to playstyle preference and the makeup of your raid. We really are free to choose whatever we like this expansion. Death Knights. With the current rotation, Death Knights feel somewhat clunky to me. The lack of mobility and the abundance of self-healing makes them feel more like a sack of potatoes that's there to be wailed on. I mean, I can't even be asked to run over to where that mob is gnawing on the healer. I'll just drag that sucker over to me, much like I would a bag of potato chips while vegging out on the couch watching TV. My, how far we've come. I had very few hopes for Death Knights at the end of Alpha, but their beta iteration is just a frolicking good time. They're certainly not as stocky as Druids, and definitely still have some mobility issues, but with the combination of excellent damage output, solid absorbs, ample self-healing, and not one but two taunts, DKs more than make up for my only gripe, which is the aforementioned mobility. We do have Wraith Walk, which would be so much better on either a shorter CD or a longer duration, but in Atlas fights where mobility is far more useful than the reduced CD on Gorfine's Grasp, we do have a talent that gives us a little something something. What I personally find most appealing about the class is that they are the least healer-dependent tank in Legion. That's not to say that I enjoy out-healing the healer, but what I do love is being able to take care of myself while the healer is busy dancing in the derp buffer, which is something I'll explain in a bit more detail in the monk section of this video. In terms of cooldowns, Death Knights don't have ones like Ardent Defender, Survival Instincts, or Shield Wall, but Vampiric Blood has helped me on so many occasions, either with or without a healer, and I certainly feel that having that crux to fall back on when beep gets real will ultimately make me a better tank. As I said, I'm not doing competitive raiding on Legion, so I don't have to worry about having as many tools at my disposal for those endless edge-of-your-seat encounters where literally every little thing counts. When it comes to off-specs, there is no healing option, which was a bit of a tough decision for me since I do enjoy those shorter healer queues. However, Unholy and Frost are decent specs, with Unholy being the more effective of the two at the moment. When it comes to gearing, the consensus seems to be Strength and Haste as the holy duo, then Mastery for more survivability, Versatility for more DPS, or Crit for a balance of the two. I've been running with Crit and it feels pretty darn good. On the topic of Mastery, Blood Shield is ours, and it takes a percentage of our Deathstrike healing and turns it into a physical damage absorption shield while also increasing our attack power. With just how much we use Deathstrike, it's no wonder DKs are in the upper levels of tank DPS. As for talent choices, I've had a chance to play around with all of them and definitely have my personal favourites. During the levelling and gearing process, I'd recommend 2-1-1-2-1-3-1 for dungeons, since there's so much AoE tanking. When it comes to making the most out of Ossuary, it's important to keep 5 charges of Bone Shield rolling, which means that with Foul Bulwark you'll also consistently have at least 10% extra health at the same time. Now, when it comes to the good old artifact weapon, the base ability is Consumption, which deals damage and heals you for 100% of that amount. So when lined up with some nice buffs and a lucky crit, it can do a pretty solid amount of healing and DPS quite regularly. In terms of unlocking artifact traits, the first golden trait I went for was Unending Thirst, which gives you Leech and extra Death Strike DPS while Bone Shield is up. After that, it's a tough call, but since I was running with Heartbreaker most of the time, I favoured Umbilicus Eternus, because Blood Feast is a mighty tasty trait and goes very well with Vein Render. After that, taking the upper path to the Skeletal Shattering golden trait seems a good way to go for survivability, or the lower path if DPS is more your thing. Overall, Death Knights are a lot of fun to play. Being so self-reliant makes them a joy to tank on, and being up to solo content is something I've always enjoyed doing in my downtime. While most of what we are and do can be considered rather lone wolfish, being able to Gorfine's Grasp adds away from ourselves onto another tank, or Huntard, as well as Battle Res, means that DKs do know how to play well with others. Sometimes. Druids. I'll admit that I'm a bit biased when it comes to Druids. I've played one since the end of Vanilla, and the new bear forms look so amazing that I really want to unlock them all as soon as possible so I can strut my stuff through Dalaran and make all the other bears jealous. That said, while bears feel solid in terms of survivability, they're just boring to play, and I worry that the skins alone won't be enough to hold my interest. In the current beta build, not a lot has changed for Druids. Their health pool is absolutely huge, but where in previous expansions this was frustrating for healers who felt that they were using an eyedropper to fill a swimming pool, the bonus healing that Legion Druids receive makes stam stacking an absolute dream. For a time, threat was a bit of an issue in raiding environments when paired with a Paladin in particular, but that seems to be less and less of a problem as time goes. One interesting thing to note about the Guardian rotation is that 2 of the 4 abilities are AoE, which makes tanking in close quarters around CC really challenging. With that said, numerous DPS classes also have AoE abilities in their single target rotation, so my hope here is that there won't be too many encounters where it'll be an issue. Druids have a similar cooldown to warriors in the form of Survival Instincts, which reduces incoming damage by 60% for 6 seconds. What's nice about it is that it has 2 charges, which means that you can chain them for 12 seconds of awesomeness. Aside from that, there's an out-of-combat res, the good old battle res, which always comes in handy, as well as Stampeding Roar, which can have its CD reduced by 50% and its radius increased by 200% via the talent Guttural Roars. Additionally, Barkskin provides a nice 20% damage reduction and can be used while incapacitated. Lastly, Druids have the ability to remove curses and poisons with Remove Corruption. When it comes to off-specs, Restoration is just too good to pass up on if you're looking to heal Mythic Plus content. A lot of the affixes there melt away with the mobility and hots of Arresto. Laser Turkeys are also solid and great in AoE situations, while Feral is very similar to how it was in WoD, having seen fewer changes and tuning than many of the other DPS classes. In terms of gearing, Mastery and Haste seem to be the dynamic duo for Legion. Haste reduces a cooldown on Mangle and Frenzied Regeneration among other abilities, which boosts both our survivability and damage output. After that, Versatility and Crit seem to be the way to go, with the former making more sense in the context of Legion Bears, whose job it is to soak damage rather than avoid it. On the topic of Mastery, Nature's Guardian is ours, and it increases our health, healing received, and attack power. Since bears are all about the massive health pools, taking increased healing is very, very handy indeed, and I can imagine some healers fighting over who gets to heal the bear for some healer meter padding. As for talent choices, Druids have a bit more flexibility than some of the other tanks. During the gearing and levelling process, I chose to run with 231, 1321 for both dungeon and questing content. As bears aren't the speediest of tanks to move around, I definitely favoured Wild Charge for a boost to our mobility, and pairing that with Balance Affinity meant that it was easy as pie to charge around spamming thrash and swipe in AoE fights, especially with those pesky casters who refuse to join the group despite being silenced. Want to buy Gorfiend's Grasp? Please send tell. Now, when it comes to the artifact, the base ability is called Rage of the Sleeper, and it reflects 25% of all incoming damage for 10 seconds. If you find yourself using it often, which you should since trash is often more challenging than bosses, there's a nice golden trait worth unlocking early on. The golden trait I wound up unlocking first was Adaptive Fur, which reduces the damage you take from elemental damage of a specific type. So, given a lot of trash packs spam attacks with the same elemental school, reducing subsequent damage by 10% for the next 15 seconds definitely helps our survivability. On the way to unlocking that trait, it's worthwhile picking up Bear Hug, as it increases our gore procs, which means more mangles and more rage. Another equally good golden trait is Embrace of the Nightmare, which buffs the aforementioned artifact ability, while also providing immunity to loss of control effects while Rage of the Sleeper is up. Given just how sturdy bears are, being able to pump out some more DPS can make a pretty significant difference over the course of a fight. One thing that bears do particularly well is take hits to the face. Since we're the epitome of a meat shield, or rather a meat wall these days, a meat mountain? Anyway, moving on. It is common occurrence for bears to be left alone with mobs slowly chipping away at their seemingly never-ending health pool, kind of like a furry target dummy. For healers, this makes things a bit more relaxed, especially when well-timed frenzied regens take care of significant portions of the larger hits. At the same time, healing bears requires a different mindset from other tanks because it's easy to fall into the continuous healing trap, which is totally unnecessary. Where a demon hunter or a monk at 30% health is something to start spamming heals on, bears at that point are finally looking to use their first stack of survival instincts and the aforementioned frenzied regen. As us Australians like to say, she'll be right, mate. Warriors. Warriors are machines. They get in there and they get the job done without the bells and whistles of other tanks. They're kind of like Old Yeller, and that, to me, doesn't make them appealing to main. Don't get me wrong, they're a great tank and I definitely want one in my raid, but without the old stance dancing and banner charging fun times of yore, I don't know. In the current beta build, not a lot has changed for warriors. They're still as solid as ever, and Ignore Pain is insanely good for the majority of Legion content. Only at higher difficulties does it become something that isn't up 100% of the time, which makes for some great solo play and questing when paired with impending victory. And in terms of mobility, warriors are great. Having 2 charges of intercept and the good old heroic leap, both off the global cooldown, this means warriors are pretty much always where they need to be. In true mid-shield style, warriors have Shield Wall, which reduces all incoming damage by 40% for 8 seconds. It's on a 4-minute CD, and where druids have 2 charges of a similar ability, it pairs nicely with Last Stand, which increases our health by 60% for 15 seconds. In addition to those, we have Battle Cry, which synergizes nicely with the Talon's Avatar and Anger Management for some nice DPS. When it comes to off-specs, Fury and Arms are both great, with Fury being particularly impressive at the moment. Again, there's no healing off-spec option for warriors, so that might be something to consider when deciding on a tank, especially since both off-specs are melee, of which there is an abundance of in Legion, I might add. In terms of gearing, Haste reigns supreme as it affects shield block and shield slam, which means less incoming damage and more rage means more Ignore Pain, which means even less incoming damage. After that, it's a toss-up between mastery and versatility, the latter being perhaps more useful in lower difficulty encounters where Ignore Pain is often up 100% of the fight. On the topic of mastery, Critical Block is ours, and it increases our chances to block and critically block while also increasing our DPS. As for the talent choices, warriors have a wide selection of viable talents compared to the other tanks. During the gearing and levelling process, I chose to run with 111-3223 for both dungeon and questing content, as it provides a nice amount of AoE and made use of the effectiveness of Ignore Pain in lower level content. Now, when it comes to the artifact weapon, the base ability is called Neltharian's Fury and allows us to critically block all incoming attacks for 3 seconds. Additionally, it emits a bit of an AoE DPS in the form of a rather cool-looking flaming shield. When it comes to unlocking the traits, Dragon Skin and Dragon Scales are insanely useful for putting warriors in a very healthy position right off the pull, by using Intercept to gain rage from a friendly target and again by charging the enemy. Following that up with a shield slam, Ignore Pain is put at almost max effectiveness. After that, the golden trait Scales of the Earth is great for survivability as it buffs our armor by a nice amount. In addition, the trait Leaping Giants provides even more mobility, because warriors don't already have enough. Personally, my biggest gripe with warriors is the artifact ability, which grants you some nice critical block for its duration, but the fact you're stuck in cement shoes and unable to use offensive abilities makes it a bit of a pain to use sometimes, most notably in encounters rife with knockbacks and ground slams. For AoE trash packs, I found that pairing it with Shockwave prevented mobs from spreading out around me, but also negated its true purpose, which is to provide critical block. However, it did mean I could pretty much use it on cooldown as long as the mobs were stunnable, while taking significantly less damage from the mob who was not. The first boss in Maw of Souls and the second in Eye of Ajara spring to mind. Another consideration during boss fights is that positioning is incredibly important, as is knowing what boss ability is coming up in order to use that 3-second window to its fullest. Finally, in terms of the DPS output, it's nothing to write home about, so I found myself seeing it merely as a defensive ability for physical attacks. Personally, I would prefer Neltharian's Fury to be an instant cast dot with a 3-second critical block buff. The short duration of the buff itself makes it something you have to think about using, as not having that 60% damage reduction available for a boss mechanic can be quite punishing at higher difficulties. I can understand why Blizzard wants to avoid making artifact abilities just something you press because it's there, but believe us when we say it's totally epic. But I feel like the inability to move is a punishment more than anything, and it made me avoid using it in some situations. Anyway, I could rant about this for days, so let's just say I'm not a fan and would love to hear your thoughts on Neltharian's Fury in the comments below. Paladins. Admittedly, I've said very little about Paladins compared to the other tanks, but that's a good thing. They're a solid, well-rounded tank, but where warriors lack the bells and whistles, Pallies bring that and more to the table. They're flashy, they're sturdy, they get the job done, and they look fabulous while doing so. They're a staple of the tanking roster and they feel familiar. The problem for me is, do I want familiarity in Legion? After the humdrum of WoD, I'm dying for something new and exciting to rekindle my WoW obsession, and I wonder if Pallies might not be able to satisfy that need. Quite recently, Paladins have divided the player base in terms of their survivability. Threat has never been an issue for them, and their damage output is soundly in the upper spectrums, but in the latest beta tuning, some people feel they're equal to, if not worse than Demon Hunters in terms of spikiness. Personally, I haven't seen that dramatic of a change and still enjoy gallivanting around on my gleaming steed. Speaking of mobility, both Paladins and Death Knights pulled the short straw there. Divine Steed is marginally better than Wraithwalk, and Paladins do make up for it with a nice ranged interrupt in the form of Avenger's Shield. Cooldowns are pretty much synonymous with Paladins. For our own survival, we have Ardent Defender on a 90-second CD, which prevents us from taking a killing blow. Blessing of Protection on a 3-minute CD, which negates all magical damage for 10 seconds. Divine Shield on a 5-minute CD, which protects us from physical and magical damage for 8 seconds. Guardian of Ancient Kings on a 5-minute CD, which makes us take 50% less damage, and if the beep hits the fan, there's always Lay on Hands on a 10-minute CD, which allows us to heal for the total amount of our health. And for the cherry on top, there's good old Avenging Wrath on a 2-minute CD for some serious DPS and healing boosts, and Blessing of Freedom on a 25-second CD, which grants immunity to slows and snares. Oh, and we can also remove poisons and diseases with cleansed toxins and resurrect people out of combat. What I've always appreciated about Paladins is the flexibility of their CDs. Blessings of Protection and Freedom and Lay on Hands can be used on allies, in addition to Blessing of Sacrifice, which is on a 90-second CD and redirects 30% of the damage taken by an ally to you. All in all, Paladins bring a lot to the rating table in terms of utility. While Retribution seems to be the runt of the DPS litter, Holy is definitely viable as a healing off-spec. I did a general review of healers in Legion, and since then Holy Pallies have become better and better at what they do. When it comes to gearing, stat priorities for prot damage output in beta rank Haste and Crit above Mastery, while Versatility and Haste are more useful for survivability. On the topic of Mastery, Divine Bulwark is ours, and it reduces incoming damage while increasing block chance and attack power. For both DPS and survivability focused gearing, this puts it kinda middle of the road-ish as a stat. As for talent choices, Paladins have a nice selection of viable talents. During the gearing and leveling process, I chose to run with 2-2-3-1-1-2-3, as it provided a nice bit of AoE, control and self-healing. My biggest challenge has been finding a use for the amazing-looking spell that is Aegis of Light, given just how much movement there is during many encounters. Discipline Priest Disco Bubbles put it to shame, since they affect a 360-degree area. Trying to group up 4 randoms within 10 yards behind you for a mere 20% damage reduction and a 5-minute cooldown, it wound up being more trouble than it's worth. That said, in organised raid environments and even Mythic Plus runs, I could perhaps see a use for it in some encounters. Overall, it's very situational though. One thing I have really struggled to feel happy with is Seraphim, simply because I feel far squishier when I'm forced to pull Shield of the Righteous charges. When running with Last Defender instead, things just feel sturdier, and in turn Light of the Protector feels more useful. However, since it is more of a DPS boost than anything, when the loot starts dropping from the skies and we all begin overgearing the content again, it would be nice to know that it's sitting there waiting for us. Now, when it comes to the artifact weapon, the base ability is called Eye of Tyr, and it's on a 1-minute CD. It causes a fixed amount of AoE holy damage, while also reducing the damage those enemies deal to us by 25% for 9 seconds. When it comes to unlocking the artifact traits, the first golden trait I went for was Tyr's Enforcer for the DPS boost. When RNGesus shined and I got a few Grand Crusader procs, it was quite nice to have on AoE fights. After that, and again because there's so much AoE content while leveling, I went with Bulwark of Order for the added shields, though that was more so because I was headed in that direction already with Consecration in Flame. Being able to have Consecration up 100% of the time and in turn buff Shield of the Righteous by 20% was just too good to pass up on. In my opinion, there have been noticeably fewer changes to Paladins than other tanks. Some reshuffling of the talents here and there and a spot of number tuning, but overall they've been pretty set in their ways from their days in Alpha. I still maintain that Paladins are just solid, dependable tanks. Perhaps a little less so given the week's tuning, but they're still in a very good place for me. Demon Hunters. Demon Hunters are by far the most fun class to play. Their mobility and damage output, together with the edge of your seat gameplay and less traditional tanking style, makes them a fresh addition to the tanking roster. My only concern is that the novelty will eventually wear off, and what I might be left with is an incredibly spammy, squishy tank. I'd like to say that Demon Hunters have come into their own in regards to their squishiness, but they're still pretty full on in that regard. For those who've been trying to heal them in the Legion pre-patch content, I'm sure a number of you are nodding your heads in agreement. To be fair, with access to only 2 of their 7 talents, that's to be expected, but even in beta they still remind me of the early days of Brewmaster monks, where you would either love or hate to heal them. I have encountered some Demon Hunters who were far squishier than others, but on a scale of 1 to, "Oh my god, where did you buy that yo-yo?" Demon Hunter health movement is definitely on the latter end of the spectrum. In terms of cooldowns, Demon Hunters have something in common with Death Knights in that there really isn't all that much to talk about. Metamorphosis is on a 3-minute CD and increases our maximum health. What's noteworthy is that we look pretty badass in demon form, which I reckon should earn us some extra points. Where Druids have 4 specs to choose from, we Demon Hunters have a mere 2. But fortunately, Havoc is definitely up there when it comes to DPS. It puts out excellent numbers and is really quite fun to play. When it comes to gearing, there's a fair bit of conflicting information about stat priorities for Demon Hunters, due in part to how limited they are on live in Legion pre-patch content. Since we only have access to our first 2 talent tiers, survivability is more of an issue than on beta, which means it's probably worthwhile going versatility and haste to smooth out incoming damage as much as possible. The fact remains that Demon Hunters are spiky as anything, and especially in pre-patch, they are a full-time job to heal. On the topic of mastery, Fell Blood is ours, and it reduces the physical damage we take while also increasing our attack power. As for talent choices, I had a play around with all of them and, as with Death Knights, definitely have my personal favourites. Given the fact there's so much AoE content while levelling, I opted for an AoE heavy build, which is rather different from the single target focused one. For AoE, I found 2-1, 2-1, 3-2-1 worked really well, while for single target fights I went with 2-1-1, 2-3-2-1. When it comes to making use of Flame Crash, I found there was a huge DPS burst when it was lined up with Infernal Strike and Immolation Aura. Getting all 3 of those abilities to hit in quick succession, if not simultaneously, regularly tripled my AoE damage on the pull and put me leagues ahead on the threat meters. One thing that comes into play a bit later is when the golden artifact trait Fueled by Pain is unlocked, which synergizes rather nicely with soul rending for both AoE and single target based leveling. Now, when it comes to the artifact weapon, the base ability is called Soul Carver and it's on a 1-minute CD. Over the course of 3 seconds, it deals upfront damage, applies a dot, rips 2 lesser soul fragments from the enemy and 3 more fragments in a staggered release. As for unlocking the artifact traits, the first golden trait I went for was Fueled by Pain, because the idea of proccing Metamorphosis every time I ate a soul fragment was a lot of fun to play around with. After that, it was a toss-up between Charred Warblades, which causes your fire damage to heal you, and Painbringer, which causes soul fragments to reduce incoming damage by a small amount. I must admit that the latter trait was probably more appealing on the days that I felt particularly squishy, but the consistent healing of Charred Warblades won me over in the end, and I opted to unlock that first. They are still fun as anything to play. Leaping, double jumping, gliding around all over the place makes for such exciting gameplay, and the only time I really worried for my safeties was when I was stunned and Demon Spikes was on cooldown. Then, it certainly does get real, so make sure you buy your resident healer a tall one afterwards. One downside of the mobility, I might add, is that it's rather easy to get into the mindset of running away and avoiding the damage you don't want to take, often meaning you find yourself out of healer range. Again, meaning you owe them a double, and I personally found myself keeping even more of a watchful eye on where my life preserver was. Demon Hunters are nothing if not busy. Monks. I was not a huge fan of monks in WoD, but I must say their Legion Alpha iteration is piquing my interest some. I've always loved mobility on tanks, and monks have never failed to disappoint in that department. However, their numbers aren't looking amazing on Alpha at the moment, which, to be fair, is probably because they were only released recently. I'll have to wait and see what beta brings. So, beta certainly did bring a lot of changes to Brewmasters. First and foremost, Gift of the Ox has seen some pretty significant tuning, to the point where I found myself in numerous occasions cursing that ever-fickle RNGesus. In fact, without the Gift of the Mists talent, Expel Harm more often than not sits on your action bar as an unusable ability, taunting you. I had more than one dungeon run where so few spheres spawned that I only got to hit the button twice. Twice the entire dungeon run. Relying on RNG for tank mitigation is something I find frustrating personally, but for others it might very well add a nice element of spice to the simplified tanking style in Legion. In terms of cooldowns, monks have an interesting collection. Our main one is Fortifying Brew on a 7-minute CD, ouch, which over the course of 15 seconds increases our health and the amount we stagger and reduces incoming damage. Other cooldowns include Transcendence, which provides some unique mobility, and Zen Meditation, which is on a 5-minute CD and reduces incoming damage by 60% for 8 seconds. Unfortunately, moving, casting another spell, or being hit with a melee attack all break the effect, so I didn't find myself using it all that often. Still, at the right moment in a magic-based fight, I'm sure it could prove to be a lifesaver. Lastly, monks are one of the 3 tanks that have an out-of-combat resurrection, while also being able to remove poison and disease effects with detox. When it comes to off-specs, I absolutely loved Windwalker and had a lot of fun with it. As for Mistweaver, if you didn't catch my healer ranking video, I've been pretty hard on them in the past, which was always at the back of my mind as I tested Brewmaster. With that said, Mistweaver is looking a lot better these days and is definitely a viable off-spec if that's what you're looking for. When it comes to gearing, hitting the Hist soft cap is the first priority for Brewmasters. Doing so reduces the cooldown on our Iron Skin and Purifying Brews, as well as Keg Smash, so aiming for 30% minimum is highly recommended. After that, there's a bit of a choice between Mastery and Crit, with the former offering breakpoints where we can guarantee that only a certain number of auto attacks in a row can hit us. On the topic of Mastery, Elusive Brawler is ours, and it increases our dodge chance every time we take a melee attack, as well as increasing our attack power. In terms of talents, monks have a nice variety to choose from. While gearing and levelling, I opted to go with 1-3-3-3-1-1-3, as it offered a nice amount of AoE control and DPS, while also increasing my Gift of the Ox procs, which meant I could use Expel Harm more frequently. Now, when it comes to the artifact weapon, the base ability is Exploding Keg and is on an 85-second CD. It deals AoE damage and causes the mob's melee attacks to miss for 3 seconds. As for unlocking the artifact traits, the first golden trait I unlocked was Brew Stash, which grants a modest amount of dodge when using Iron Skin and Purifying Brews. After that, given just how much AoE content there is to tank while levelling, I opted for Dragonfire Brew for some more fire-breathing love. Overall, I wasn't as impressed with the golden traits for Fuzan as I was with the other tanks. As such, I wound up meandering my way through the artifact paths, picking and choosing the normal traits I wanted, and eventually unlocking the golden ones as I went. Generally speaking, Brewmasters rely on the vigilance of their healers. While the decay rate of stagger is such that it's not all that deadly, it does mean hot-based healers are at a distinct advantage when it comes to keeping Brewmasters in their safe zone. Where bears can be left to their own devices for a while, thanks to their massive health pools, and Death Knights more often than not out-heal the healer anyway, Brewmasters don't have that luxury. In and of itself, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does reduce the dirt buffer of the group, and what I mean by dirt buffer is that we're all human, and mistakes are made. When that happens, and someone is stunned, an interrupt is missed, a DPS stands too long in bad, people run out of the healer range, or the lag boss steps into the room, all of these things place a bit more pressure on Brewmaster-driven groups, which I've no doubt is an appealing concept for some of the tanks concerned about the simplified tanking style in Legion. For those people, I encourage you to give monks a try. The other gremlin I encountered while in the aforementioned derp buffer is related to the DPS output of Brewmasters. Since their DPS is on the low end of the spectrum, I found that threat actually does exist in Legion. The problem is that groups are spoiled by the likes of DKs and Paladins who have little to no threat issues, so when a monk steps up to the plate, DPS don't expect any problems, and before you know it, you're having to taunt and stun or even Black Ox statue just to keep things under control. Now, once again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you're a pug tank like me, it becomes an exercise in patience that after a while gets rather tiring, and I found myself taking breaks more often from my monk than any other tank. And that about sums it up. Now, if you haven't already guessed, I'm rolling with Death Knight for the launch of Legion, but I want to take a few minutes just to explain why that is. You see, because I'm going to be creating raid guides, much like the ones I did for Warlords of Draenor content, I have a very short period of time in which to see all of the fights and record enough footage so I can actually show all of the raid mechanics in said videos. As such, I'll be pugging my Emerald, Nightmare and Nighthold progression, which means I had to rule out a few of the tanks based on how unappealing they would be for pug groups. Being the umpteenth demon hunter signing up for someone's raid means I'll be less likely to be invited, and while I love bears, they're being eyeballed by enough hardcore raiding guilds that I dare say they'll also be rather saturated. With those two off the list, I opted for something that will be hopefully less common, but, comparatively speaking, but will also allow me to record other videos in the downtime between raids. So being able to solo content was a definite plus in the Death Knight books, since that'll give me something extra to work on. With all of that said, I will definitely be rolling with my beloved bear and a demon hunter as my alts. I mean, come on, how can anyone not roll Druid for those lovely artifact skins? Anyway, thanks very much for the company. Enjoy the rest of your morning, day, afternoon, evening, whatever the case may be, and I'll hopefully see you in the Emerald Nightmare.